Welcome everyone. I'm Ian Blanding with the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, and I'd like to welcome you to the US DOE Building Energy Codes Seminar Series. Today's seminar will cover zoning and land use regulation and identifying tools to help advance climate-friendly development. So looking ahead, this is our last topic slated for this series is focused on a discussion around equity, energy codes, and addressing affordable housing needs. So that the last topic is on November 18th. So we hope you'll join us for that topic as well as future BECP webinars. So now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our moderator to get the conversation started. So we're happy to have Rodney Sobin with the U.S. National Association of State Energy Officials to guide us through this topic. So welcome, Rodney, and please take it away.
Thank you very much, Ian. I appreciate this. And thank you also to the Department of Energy and its Building Energy Codes program for hosting us today, as well as the whole series of seminar webinars. And thank you to PNL for its support, Ian and his colleagues. Today's webinar will examine some of the relationships between building energy codes to zoning and land use regulation. Zoning and land use processes have at times incentivized environmentally sensitive design and construction, yet also safety, aesthetic, and other concerns have sometimes impeded approvals and installation of such measures as batteries and photovoltaics. Increasingly, it seems that different types of energy and environmental policies and programs are interacting. Building codes and zoning and land use, which you'll hear about today, but also appliance standards, benchmarking and disclosure, labeling and rating systems, building performance standards for existing buildings, which you'll hear a bit about today as well. There can be carrots and sticks, mandatory standards and requirements, negotiated conditions, and voluntary measures. These can be supported by technical assistance and education for local officials, builders, and communities. Also, financial incentives and flexibilities to accommodate or encourage greener development can help. We're very privileged today to have 4 great speakers on these topics. Today's webinar will explore the ways that zoning and land use regulation can work in complement to codes and can be crafted to advance energy efficiency, clean energy, and climate objectives. Let me take a few moments to introduce our speakers before going to the main event. First up to bat will be Kai Palmer-Dunning, who is with NEAP, the Northeast Energy Efficiency Partnerships. He is a Building and Community Solutions Associate, providing support and technical assistance to community stakeholders and municipalities in Massachusetts to achieve net zero energy and carbon for their buildings. He also supports the Helix project to better integrate and consolidate residential solar data into multiple listing service platforms in the real estate market in the region. Prior to NEAP, Kai worked at the U.S. Green Buildings Council Massachusetts chapter on workforce training program grants to help local building firms become trained in LEED, GPRO, and energy modeling. He's also worked and currently serves on the Massachusetts Climate Action Network. He has experience in grassroots community organizing, local zoning regulation, residential energy efficiency, and green buildings. He's completing his bachelor's at Northeastern University and pursuing a master's of architecture and urban design as well. And he holds a LEED GA credential from USGPC. He'll be followed by Katrina Madigan, who leads the high performance buildings and homes team for the City and County of Denver's Office of Climate Action, Sustainability, and Resiliency. Her team is working to make all new and existing buildings and homes in Denver's net zero energy more sustainable and more resilient. Katrina has been with the city for 7 years and led work to develop the benchmarking ordinance for existing buildings, the Green Buildings Ordinance, the 2019 Denver IECC, the first ever Denver Green Code, and the Energized Denver Building Performance Policy. Following Katrina will be Ellen Egerton, who is the Sustainability Coordinator for the City of Alexandria, Virginia, which is next door to me. She facilitated the 2019 update of the Environmental Action Plan, EAP 2040, which is the city's sustainability roadmap. She works on implementation and metrics of Eco-City Alexandria programs, policies, and projects to promote sustainability, and works with planning and zoning staff on the application of the 2019 Green Buildings Policy and New Development. She has long served on the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, Built Environment, and Energy Advisory Committees, and the Energy Committee for the Virginia Building Code Officials Association. She has worked on energy conservation code development, both at state and national levels, and has long experience in plan reviews, green buildings, and land development issues. Her bachelor's is in mechanical engineering from Catholic University of America, has a master's in administration from the University of Maryland. She's a licensed professional engineer in Virginia and holds building code certifications in mechanical, plumbing, and accessibility. Batting cleanup will be Jennifer Meniere, who is a team lead for the Clean Energy Siting Team at NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, where she helps local government officials through best practices and appropriate local laws and permitting procedures for solar and battery energy storage. Her team provides resources, education, technical assistance to help local governments understand how to manage responsible clean energy development in their communities. She has also had leadership roles with NYSERDA's Climate Smart Communities Regional Pilot Program and the state's Cleaner, Greener Communities Program. Her BA is from Hamilton College with a concentration in geology and a minor in economics, and has master's degrees in education from Elmira College and a master's in ecological economics, values, and policy from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. So I've babbled enough and would like to hand it to Kai.
Everybody, thanks, Rodney. So again, my name is Kai Palmer-Dunning. I'm the Buildings and Community Solutions Associate at Northeast Energy Efficiency Partnerships. And go to the next slide. So Northeast Energy Efficiency Partnerships, or NEAP, is one of 6 regional energy efficiency organizations in the United States. We help states in our region with energy efficiency, decarbonization, and other policy and building efforts. So if you are from a state in the Northeast or Mid-Atlantic region, feel free to reach out to us. We'd be happy to help assist you in your decarbonization and energy efficiency efforts. Next slide. So I'll be kicking us off and kind of spending some time grounding the conversation on zoning and land use and how it relates to building energy and building codes. So in the 1920s, the U.S. Commerce Department drafted the first model zoning ordinance for states, and then following that, in the 1970s, the U.S. Congress created the first national energy model code. So zoning is far older than building codes and has been and often was used as the primary way to decide how buildings were built before national model building codes were created. So building energy specifically is typically regulated by building codes. However, some states prevent local jurisdictions from passing local ordinances that touch the topic of building energy. So essentially, if building energy is handled within the code, zoning isn't able to do the same things and touch upon building energy in some states. Next slide. So what does zoning regulate? So zoning determines how the land use, the land use of buildings, as well as lot characteristics, traffic, and landscaping features. So for land use districts, the districts that we'll be talking about are residential, commercial, industrial, and agriculture. And then in terms of lot characteristics, that could be anything from the size of the building, the density of how many people are in the building, Now, the building height, the setback from the street, as well as other aspects, and also traffic and parking, how traffic flows, and parking or on-street parking, as well as parking at commercial buildings. And finally, landscape and space. So how much of the land is meant for green space and pervious hard surfaces like asphalt. Next slide. So, so according to the EIA, the 2020 energy consumption by end-use sector, if we look at the graph, commercial, industrial, residential take up a large portion of the graph. So zoning and building codes touch upon all these end-use sectors, and so it's very important to have these considerations and think about this as we are crafting zoning and building codes, understanding that the building energy is a huge part of our total energy load. Next slide. So what's the impact of zoning on building energy? So zoning can be used for green space, hardscape, and roof services. So in terms of how zoning handles those things, things like urban heat island effect and stormwater management come into play. And I'll be getting a little bit more into what urban heat island effect is and how it affects energy and as well as people. Next, the setback requirements. So they talked, zoning determines how far the building is set back from the street. So in terms of how that affects energy, building energy, building insulation. Building insulation is a factor within the setback, as well as passive solar. So in terms of how the overhang of the roof and how much that counts towards the setback also play a role in the building's energy. And finally, the building height and density. So rooftop solar is a huge consideration for building height. If in places where zoning doesn't take solar into consideration, that an added height because of solar could come into conflict with what's zoned for that district. And finally, density, which a lot of districts are looking at are transit-oriented development. So focusing development around public transportation and other fairways, and understanding that building at a higher density in those areas can reduce people's use of cars, which obviously contribute to carbon emissions from transportation. Next slide. So a little bit more about heat island effect. Heat island effect is urban areas where structures are highly concentrated. There's limited greenery, so there's lots of hardscape and dark surfaces that attract heat, become islands, and can create higher temperatures, which have both an effect on people's health, obviously the temperature of that area, as well as the energy used on things like air conditioning. So in areas where there is a high heat island effect, daytime temperatures can range from 1 to 7 degrees higher during the day, and then at nighttime 2 to 5 degrees, and that can be exacerbated in areas where there is a higher level of heat island. So thinking of cities like New York and Houston, where there is a higher degree of hardscape, those temperatures can be far higher during daytime hours. Thanks. Again, heat island effects contribute greatly to increased energy consumption through the use of higher needs for air conditioning, which can lead to things like rolling blackouts and brownouts. And so cities that are often experiencing acute heat island effects feel that on the grid, feel that strain on the grid because of more usage of air conditioning. Next slide. So looking at the effect that the heat island effects on people, so specifically on low-income communities where older homes that are poorly insulated and have weak electrical systems, the added need for air conditioning, having to run air conditioning all day, could have a huge strain on those houses. And because they're poorly insulated, they're not holding on to that cool air, and it's causing utility bills to be a lot higher for low-income communities, which puts a strain on them and increases their and leads to having a higher energy burden. Next, elderly people and people with health issues. They are at a higher risk for heat strokes and respiratory distress because of heat island effect. They aren't able to get the same level of comfort and safety from heat island effect in cities where there's higher heat island effect as well. And finally, poor area quality, which again has an effect on vulnerable and elderly people. Research has found that redlined areas often have less trees and higher temperatures, and there's a higher degree of hardscape to green space. There's a higher ratio of hardscape to green space. So we're talking about redline areas, we're talking about keenies, where are areas of the city that have been designated, that have been mapped so that specific populations live in one area versus in another. And I won't get into a lot of that, but that's a consideration, and a lot of research has been done around how redline neighborhoods often coincide with areas that experience higher levels of heat island effect. Next slide. So spending a little bit, providing a few examples of how different cities and municipalities have used the zoning to address building energy. So looking at Somerville, they recently did an overhaul on their zoning code and incorporated building energy language into their zoning. One aspect of that was the green score, which uses a similar structure as a similar language as the Seattle Ordinance. So the green score is a performance-based environmental landscaping standard that uses a weighted point system that incentivizes different landscape and site design elements. And these elements do touch, aren't directly connected to energy, but do touch upon energy. The green score touches upon things like reducing stormwater runoff, improve urban air quality, mitigating urban heat island effect, which you just talked about, and the effect it has on building energy usage, as well as improving the well-being and of residents and visitors. And so Somerville, in addition to doing this overhaul on their zoning code to better address energy, the city is also committed to adopting a zero energy stretch code, which is currently being developed in Massachusetts. So this is a way in which the zoning in Somerville is trying to work in concert with updates to the building code around energy and really prioritizing that. And so Massachusetts specifically is a state where the building code and zoning can't do exactly the same thing. So the zoning can't touch upon the same thing that the building codes around energy, so the zoning can't go above and require more energy efficiency than the building code does. So Somerville used the green score to address some of these things but stay out of what the code does. Next slide. Next, Denver. Talking about Denver, Colorado, and I know Katrina, who will be going after me, will be talking more about this. So I'll just briefly touch upon the Denver Green Building Ordinance, and she can go into more depth about that. So in Denver, they passed an ordinance that offers flexible pathways for compliance for green buildings, for new buildings over 25,000 square feet up, and additions 50,000 square feet and up. And so one of the requirements is a cool roof. So a roof that reflects sunlight is considered a cool roof, so it's not absorbing that sunlight, which is part of the heat island effect that I talked about earlier. But it reflects sunlight, which reduces the building's energy load. In addition to that cool roof requirement, the buildings can also comply by following one of the pathways that include payments into a green building fund, on-site solar, purchasing off-site solar energy, reducing or providing energy conservation of at least 12% above the code, as well as getting a green building certification like LEED or Passive House. Next slide. So a few considerations for municipalities that are looking at their zoning and want to try to implement strategies for their zoning to better address building energy. And think about allowing for building orientation exemptions to maximize daylighting, especially in winter times ensuring that there is enough daylight getting into the building to lessen the load on lighting. Promoting covered parking in commercial districts to reduce heat island effect, and in addition to having covered parking, potentially using that covered parking for canopy solar. Setting a minimum solar reflectance index, or SRI, for the roofs for in commercial and industrial districts. Going back to the Denver example, the cool roofs, that's kind of what SRI is for the solar reflectance index. And then finally, exempting overhangs and exterior wall thickness for counting towards the gross square footage. So really, it's really looking at the setback and putting exemptions in there. So allowing for buildings to have thicker insulations and overhangs to better insulate and make the building tighter, more energy efficient, and allowing for overhangs. I think that is my final slide. So thank you, everybody, and I'm here to answer questions at the end.
Thank you, Kai. Appreciate that a lot. And we will have the Q&A at the end. We do encourage people to use the questions box to offer their questions. So Katrina, take it away.
Okay. Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you today. Thank you so much for having me. I look a little off center on the camera somehow. All right. I'm not sure. I think it reset a bit. It's lovely to be here. Thank you all for your interest in how zoning and land use regulation and other policy tools can advance climate-friendly development. I will go through just a really high-level summary of a lot of the work happening here in Denver. We can go to the next slide. I'll start by just covering on the next slide the overview of sort of the structure of Denver's different building regulations as they relate to climate-friendly development. So we are a home rule state in Colorado. So unlike what Kai said, we're one of the states where cities and municipalities can adopt our own energy code and regulate energy directly. So that's the right-hand side of this graph here. The Denver Building and Fire Code is something we update every 3 years. Our Office of Climate Action, Sustainability, and Resiliency works really closely with the Community Planning and Development Department and the building official on each code update. We will be going through a code update process in the first half of 2022, but right now we have the 2019 Denver Building and Fire Code in place. We also have the first ever voluntary Denver Green Code, which we passed in 2019. It's an optional code that builders can use. It lets us test items in code that might be able to move into base code in the future. I'll go into each of these in further depth, but I just want you to sort of get familiar with the overall structure in Denver first, because then there's other Denver ordinances, which aren't part of code, but like the zoning code is its own thing. I'll touch on some of what we're thinking about doing in zoning code. We haven't done a lot that's really specific to date so far in zoning code, but we're starting to do some planning around that. I'll talk about our Energized Denver Building Performance Ordinance, because that will have some direction to move certain things into the building code, and the Green Building Ordinance, which layers on top of our building code and sort of syncs with our zoning code, but it doesn't sit in either the zoning code or the building code. So let's go to the next slide and I'll start just going through each of these. So first we have the 2022 code adoption process. So I'll talk about this kind of right-hand side of the chart. So if you go to the next slide, just as a little context, you can see the sort of landscape across the country of cities and states that are pursuing net zero building energy codes and other policies. And this map includes all of those who have sort of a goal to bring their code to net zero. So if you go to the next slide, I'll talk about, this is our code adoption process for 2022. So before I go into this process, the 2019 Denver Building Code, which we adopted now 2 years ago, does require all new commercial buildings to be 15% more efficient than the national 2018 I codes, which are what we adopted, but we amended those I codes so that Denver's buildings are 15% more efficient than that national code would have required. And residential single family buildings would be 10% more efficient than what that national code required. So now we're trying to take the next step towards net zero by 2030 for all new buildings. And so here's the process we've gone through to update our building code. We published city amendments, requested public amendments, requested applications for our technical advisory committees. We will start work with the technical advisory committees in January, and they will vote on which amendments we want to move forward. And then we will bring all of that to City Council next summer. So we're doing a lot of work right now to refine the public amendments, to finish all of our city proposed amendments for the committee's consideration for our 2022 building code. If you go to the next slide, you can see that kind of trajectory for what we hope to do with both commercial and multifamily buildings and residential buildings in the energy code. So you can see in orange where the I codes have been, in blue where the ASHRAE standards have been on the left, and the 2019 Denver Energy Code is shown here, as well as the 2019 Denver Green Code, which has energy, but it also includes a lot of these other green elements that you heard Kai mentioning. It has a whole chapter on water, has a whole chapter on site sustainability, and a number of other kind of green areas. And so it's not just that Denver Green Code is not just energy focused. And you can see the same kind of path for residential energy. We have a net zero new building implementation plan. If you just search for that, you'll find it pretty easily, that lays out all the steps we hope to follow in our building code to kind of, through an every 3-year update process, bring building code to where all new buildings are net zero by 2030. And that's really we mean that by 2030, they are performing as they were designed to perform, not just being built where they intend to be net zero. So next slide, we'll go into some of what we're starting to consider in the zoning code. So if we go to the next slide, just to center sort of where this is, it's separate from the building code. And on the next slide, I'll talk through just a little bit of what we're really starting to scope in terms of what might be possible in our zoning code. And you heard Kai touch on a bunch of this, but we're looking at things like landscape regulations, and that governs what kind of soil volume does a tree need to be given, what kind of plants need to be planted, because we are in arid prairie, a high desert prairie in Denver. That's what comes right up to the mountains, and then the mountains start, and they're pretty arid too, but we don't have a lot of water. And so how do we make sure people are planting appropriate plants for our climate? How do we change lot coverage standards, parking requirements? Can we require district energy systems? There's a really cool district energy system being built at our new National Western Center complex. It's a big kind of complex. The city is collaborating with Colorado State University to run our stock show, but also do lots of agricultural trainings. And that whole campus is going to be powered by a waste heat to energy system. They'll be pulling energy from the sewer pipes that run along through the property. And it's just extra waste heat that was just warming the river after that water was cleaned and dumped back in, and they're converting it into energy on the campus. And so how do we get more large developments to be planning for that kind of district energy system? Some of that sits in zoning, or would sit in zoning. So next I'll just touch on that green building ordinance that you heard about. If we go to the next slide, again, you can just see where that fits. It's a sort of a standalone ordinance that layers on top of other existing regulations. If you go to the next slide, some of why the green building ordinance was put in place, and this was initially led by voters to put the requirements on the ballot, and they passed it, is because Denver has a really has a warming climate, of course, like everyone else, but also a really high urban heat island. If you go to that next slide, you can see how the areas of our city that have the greatest needs tend to correlate. So impervious surface, you can see that northeast and southwest has much more, and sort of there's like an inverted L that you will see along the west side of our city and the north side of our city. For all of these maps, there's more people of color that live in the inverted L. There's less vehicle access in the inverted L. The yellow is the inverted L that has higher poverty. There's less tree canopy in the inverted L. There's more people with disability. And so we know that there's sort of, and if you go to the next slide, you can also see how that same inverted L shows up in our heat vulnerability index. The areas that have the least tree cover and have the most people of color and have the most vulnerable populations also have the greatest heat vulnerability. So go to the next slide, you can see the green building ordinance requirements. A cool roof is required for all buildings over 25,000 square feet. You know, before this ordinance, about 70% of the buildings were putting on a cool roof anyway. They don't cost anymore. It's a superior product. But this was a really huge market for black roof vendors prior to us just requiring cool roofs. And so we don't want to allow those products in Denver anymore. And this ordinance requires cool roofs for all those buildings. Then it also requires buildings to pick one compliance option for a new building, as well as one compliance option for any existing building replacing their roof. And here you can see the options. They can do like a green roof, they can add green space to the site, they can do a combination of green and solar or energy efficiency, or they can do solar or energy efficiency. So all new developments and all roof replacements are really contributing to the sustainability and resiliency of our city. This was put in place in 2018. So we've got a pretty good track record where this is starting to roll out, and people are picking a mix of compliance options in developments across the city. So I think the ordinance is working and really will, especially, you know, we add about 2% to our building stock every year. We are growing, that's growing pretty quickly. And so as more and more buildings are built under this ordinance, the impact of it will kind of grow over time. Next slide, I'll talk about the Energized Denver task force. This is now returning to existing buildings. That's really kind of the last piece of what I wanted to cover, because the organizers were interested in how we are starting to contemplate and work on this policy to require higher performance from our existing buildings. So if we go to the next slide, we know that 49% of Denver's greenhouse gas emissions come from buildings, and this is commercial and multifamily buildings. Another 15% or so come from homes. So this policy is going to improve the performance of all of these existing buildings. And then the code work I just talked about and the green building ordinance help improve the performance of all those new buildings. So we do add we'll have, you know, about half of our building stock will be new by 2050. So let's talk about what we're doing on the existing buildings. Next slide. We formed the Energized Denver Task Force to help us achieve this goal of achieving net zero energy in all of our existing buildings by 2040. On the left, you can see the blue electricity carbon emissions, and in yellow, the fossil gas or natural gas carbon emissions in 2020 from all of our commercial and multifamily buildings. And the open bars are really what we charged the task force with figuring out how to meet. So, the task force was really diverse stakeholders, including a lot of folks from across our real estate sector, from building owners and managers, hotels, apartments, condos, all of our biggest building types, as well as affordable housing providers and nonprofit and tenant representatives, and our local utility and oil and gas and energy providers, and clean energy advocates, environmental groups, building energy experts. And we challenged those 25 diverse people to come to consensus about how to regulate the open bars. How do we require our buildings to be at net zero by 2040? If you go to the next slide, you can see kind of what we charged them, what they came up with. Sorry. So what they have recommended to us, and we will be bringing an ordinance that reflects this to City Council for their consideration on November 3rd. And so what they have recommended to us is that we require a 30% improvement in energy performance for all existing buildings by 2030, and every building will have its own trajectory. So here's an example of how this will work for offices. All offices would have a target of an energy use intensity of 50, which is how much energy is used per square foot by 2030. The Office A uses a lot more energy today than Office C. It has 100 kBTUs used per square foot every year, and Office C only uses 60. They're much closer to the final target. So every single building will have its own line or trajectory drawn to get to the same final target. They will have binding interim targets in 2024 and 2027, so that no one has to save an unachievable amount in any one year. They have a glide path to that final target. 15% of buildings and 15% of offices in this case here are already better than that final target. That's what it takes to save 30% across all buildings, is that everyone has to be as good as that top 15% of buildings today. So this will be one requirement that we'll be bringing to City Council for their approval. Will be in committee on November 3rd, hopefully passage through council in November. The second requirement, which I think was really of interest to this group and is a little more tied, so if we go to the next slide, you can see what the task force has recommended regarding renewable heating and cooling. So moving from natural gas, space, and water heat to electric, space, and water heat is a critical climate strategy. If we're going to have zero emissions in buildings, we have to stop burning natural gas. And if we're going to have zero emissions as a city, we have to stop burning natural gas in our buildings. Our grid will be 80% renewable in 2030. Our local utility, Xcel Energy, is required to reach that target. They will be carbon free in 2050. So, and the grid has capacity to move to renewable heating. So we are looking at how do we help buildings meet those performance targets you just heard about, and really make sure that all buildings are moving off of gas for space and water heat when it's cost effective, when they're already replacing their systems. We have a whole renewable heating and cooling plan. Again, you can find that easily if you Google it. It looks at how to electrify all the homes and buildings in Denver and the cost to do that by system type. And there's a lot, even in Denver, which is a heating dominated climate. It gets cold here in the winter. It is cost effective and at cost parity or near cost parity to move to a heat pump for space and water heat in most system types, and often to be at or near cost parity today, we do need to keep gas backup for those very coldest days. That's why this is partial electrification. And so the task force recommended that we sort of phase in these requirements in code over time. So The ordinance we'll be bringing to City Council will sort of direct that we roll these requirements into code on specific dates. And again, that will roll into our building code then over time, because as a home rule state, we can't adopt our own energy regulations. So as a city in a home rule state, we can adopt our own energy regulations. So phase one, we have the system requirements. There won't be any until next year, but we will offer incentives for electrification schematic design. And we're very fortunate in Denver. Our voters a year ago passed what is called the Climate Protection Fund. It's a sales tax that funds our office's work with about $40 million per year in funding. So we have money to actually help building owners and managers start to do this. So we will help them first start to study what would it take to electrify, so that all of the building owners and managers and the engineers and the system installers and contractors become familiar with these systems. Second, we will make the permitting equal, because today it's harder to permit a heat pump than a gas system. And the incentives for heat pumps will be offered for all buildings to get the market, again, ready for requirements. We will be offering incentives to try to drive people to adopt heat pumps at the time of system replacement. And then phase three are requirements for easy to electrify system types in 2025 and harder to electrify system types in 2027. And those harder to electrify system types are really the buildings that have boilers in them. The hydronic water-based systems are harder to electrify. So if we go to the next slide, I'll just show you the climate benefits that result from these task force recommendations. The goal, sort of in terms of cumulative carbon emission reductions that I showed you on that graph, was 13.7 million tons of CO2 saved. And the cumulative benefit of the policies the task force recommended were 11.8 million tons of CO2 saved. And while this doesn't achieve the task force goal, it does get about 80% of the way there. And I think that's a pretty tremendous step forward to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 80% in all of our existing buildings in Denver by 2040. We are told by the task force to reevaluate the regulations and the technology every 4 years. So we hope as technology advances, we can do more over time. Thank you all so much for your time and interest. We can go to the last slide and move on to the next speaker. Happy to take questions.
Thank you, Katrina. I should say your mention of open bars made me think of strong beverages personally. But it's great to see the confluence of multiple policies and regulatory types being employed or planned to be employed in Denver. Let's move on to Ellen to get a view from Alexandria, Virginia.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm sorry you can't see me. My web camera decided not to connect with this platform today, but I am here. I want to say that there's a direct connection between building codes, zoning and land use regulations, climate policies, and equity issues. First, a reminder that building codes are a minimum performance and construction code. Communities can put in place programs and policies that prioritize some environmental issues and advance the city's goals and targets. There are always choices to be made. Green building policies are one method jurisdictions use to make buildings more energy efficient than the minimum required building codes. The green building policy in the city of Alexandria has priority points on energy efficiency, renewable energy, water efficiency, and air quality. The state and city stormwater regulations significantly affect land use and zoning approval. We have a stormwater utility that funds some local efforts, but state grants can be a part and are a part of bigger projects. Our green building policies have included water efficiencies, not only ones inside, like with EPA, Environmental Policy Administration, water sense fixtures, but also landscaping. And energy efficiency building programs and support programs like CPACE, which is Commercial Property Assessed Clean Energy, provide a tool for individual property owners to get financing. but there are not typical municipal revenue streams like she just pointed out in Denver to advance an energy efficiency in the city of Alexandria for existing buildings at the local level. Here in the city of Alexandria, different than in Denver, we have significant rainfall, and we are a tidal riverfront city, and therefore stormwater and flooding are a priority for our city. Next slide. The city of Alexandria has a long history of environmental planning that includes our previous 2009 Environmental Action Plan and a 2009 Green Building Policy. In 2019, both our Environmental Action Plan and our Green Building Policy were updated. Our Environmental Action Plan has 122 actions. Other actions related to land development, such as open space targets and even hiring a sustainability coordinator to advance environmental issues, are tools that communities can use. The City Council adopted these goals and targets in our Environmental Action Plan, and we try to coordinate all of our programs in the city to advance these goals and targets. Now, unlike Denver, Virginia is a Dillon Rule state. That means it's just like the opposite of a home rule state. The city has the authority to write land use and zoning ordinance, but cannot change the building code, and that includes the energy code of the building code. But our green building policy allows the city to advance city goals and targets beyond the building code. Next slide. So kind of a recap of where the national model codes have gone. Model code energy conservation codes have over time become more efficient, but states and cities can make changes as a part of this adoptive process. So for instance, they can either go more or less efficient. The state of Virginia has pretty much adopted the model code for commercial buildings without any changes, whereas the residential code in the state of Virginia has been made less efficient over time as each code has been adopted. This chart shows the calculated impact from combined residential and commercial energy codes, but the two codes have not changed the same over time. Reminder that the residential code only applies to 1 and 2 family dwelling units, not to multifamily, just to make sure we're understanding the same issues. And note that the 30% increase in building efficiency from 2006 to 2012, and I actively worked on this, was the biggest increase compared to the relatively minor efficiency gains in other years. Next slide. So as we do code development of the energy code, that process has included things that actually didn't get into, for instance, the most recently approved model code, which was the 2021 code. So the chart on the previous slide showed a question mark of where the 2021 code was going, because that was not clear at the time that that chart was made and was decided much later after the chart was created. So electric vehicles and solar infrastructure were included as part of the 2021 model code, but they were taken out by the International Code Council Board of Directors, and changes were also made to the code development process. So states and municipalities still have the options of moving forward sustainable goals and targets through other options. And one of them that we're talking about today is that land development and zoning process. So municipalities have that option, and green building policies in cities are part of that option. Next slide. So this graph is different from that one showed by Kai that was a national profile. This is actually the profile for the city of Alexandria. And for us, we don't have an industrial load, but our emissions are 57% from buildings. This chart is a citywide greenhouse gas emissions. And we add that commercial and residential building together to get that 50%. New buildings through the zoning development process have been complying with our green building policy since 2009 and are more efficient than our older buildings. So new buildings go beyond that minimum energy code. So there has not been the same focus on existing buildings that do not come under the zoning and land use policy process. And most new buildings fall under that development process as commercial buildings. And so again, commercial buildings include multifamily buildings. Any building that has more than 2 dwelling units has to comply with the commercial codes. Next slide. Okay, so in the city of Alexandria, multifamily is 65% of housing. That is probably not similar to other more suburban or rural communities. So here we have that multifamily is really a majority of our housing. Zoning and land use regulations and our limited available space in our 15 square mile city results in this pattern of housing stock. This also means that our housing unit size is smaller in the city of Alexandria. And that this, for instance, you can see that 40% of our housing is for units with more than buildings with more than 19 units. A relationship between the increase in energy efficiency in the building code is much more complex than just this discussion and should be evaluated by the Department of Energy and others. It is bigger than any one city. So one purpose of land use and zoning in Alexandria is to increase the amount of affordable housing. So every housing unit is heated and cooled. And we have in our region a more balance of heating and cooling season. We're more like a 50-50. But the energy burden directly or indirectly affects tenants or owners based on their income profile. So energy burden is a percent of the income spent on utility bills. So energy bills are a substantial component of housing costs, and therefore energy burden affects housing affordability for low and moderate income households. Next slide. So in the city of Alexandria, this is a chart of what has been the biggest drivers of changes in emissions from our base year of 2005 to our most recent inventory of 2018. So the top increases in emissions are in red and the decreases are shown in blue. So commercial floor area, the second red block, has increased in the city, but the commercial energy use per square foot has decreased in emissions in the second blue box. Intuitively, this looks like our green building policy has had an effect on reducing energy consumption in new buildings. Based on emission data, including single metered multifamily, again, if you're metered individually, that's a residential rate, have had a decrease in electrical energy use. I say intuitively for this because we have not done data analysis to demonstrate this linkage. Older buildings are still not as energy efficient as we need them to be to meet Paris Agreement targets and our own environmental action plan goals. But older buildings have a direct effect on energy use and cost for people who live there. Next slide. Energy burden by income. So energy burden is higher on low-income residents. Low-income residents' energy burden is more than 3 times that of moderate income and 7 times more than higher income households. Alexandria low and moderate income households fare better than Virginia statewide and even the neighboring jurisdictions. That lower burden is likely due to the higher percent of multifamily units in Alexandria, as shown on that previous slide. Multifamily units have lower energy building and lower energy bills than single family homes. But energy burden is also affected by age and applicable building codes and green building policies in place at the time of construction. Most of the buildings in the region were built prior to the adoption of updated codes and green building policies. And older, less efficient buildings contribute to this energy burden. Next slide. So this graph illustrates information just for Alexandria. The black dot that it shows in the first graph column shows that the energy burden is the highest for the lowest income group. Next slide. So improving existing buildings. Land use and zoning policies result in increased energy efficiency in buildings and can go beyond minimum energy codes and can contribute to our goals and climates. Energy codes have only been minimally applied to existing buildings, and the energy codes in Virginia really most often for existing buildings only apply to roof replacement and insulation. So we have a whole code just called the existing building code. But applying new energy codes to existing building renovations could improve building energy efficiency. So climate mitigation cannot wait for the slow pace of national and state building codes to help municipalities achieve these sustainability goals. Green building policies in the land development process are how communities are demonstrating their desires to implement code changes now to mitigate climate change and work towards our own goals and targets and Paris Agreement that many of us have signed on to support. The building plan review process for Virginia right now enforces only the minimum energy code. It's the zoning and the green building policies that allow us to go beyond the minimum code. So right now, more efficient design features under a zoning development process and that green building policy are more of a negotiated process that pushes sustainability. But we really need to move these codes, these national codes and state codes to improve for existing buildings. We should remember that these complementary benefits that we address in climate mitigation through land use and the building codes complement each other in many ways, not only for energy efficiency, emission reduction, but also stormwater controls. Next slide. So I just wanted to share that many actions can be taken by individuals, families, neighborhoods, municipalities, states, and governments to regulate, facilitate, and fund changes to building codes and zoning to mitigate climate change. So I want to say that it is not one solution. It's not just building codes, it's not just zoning ordinance, it's also actions on our part that can reduce the energy and emission loads produced. So here's just one example that does both reducing energy and water use is a pause button on a shower. That circle shows that pause button. And I just wanted to share that it really is the collective actions of all of us. Thanks.
Thank you, Ellen. That was really good. Great to see these mixtures of policies and programs being used in Alexandria, my neighbor. I'm in Fairfax County, and I'll be pushing on my county to follow your example, as well as others in the neighborhood. Batting cleanup, Jennifer, please tell us what you all are doing at NYSERDA to support your localities in this area.
Great, happy to, thank you. So NYSERDA, for those of you who don't know, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, it's sort of a long-winded way of saying the State Energy Office. We deal with everything from buildings, efficiency, generation, transportation, workforce development, storage, like you name it. But I'm going to be focusing on renewables and storage, where to put them, and how to safely and responsibly permit them. So again, I'm Jen Manier, program manager on NYSERDA's clean energy siting team. What you see on the right-hand side, next slide, please. On the right-hand side of this slide are the covers of some of the bread and butter of what my team does, which is provide guidebooks for local government officials, typically focusing on solar, wind, and energy storage. And I'm just gonna try to give you a high-level overview of the types of things that are in there and what our team does. It would take hours and hours to go through all the details. So just think of this as a taste and know that everything I'm gonna share with you today is on our website for download, and you can always reach out to us for more information as well. So next slide, please. So New York's Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act was signed into law in 2019. It gives us some pretty ambitious mandates and goals to meet. We need to have 70% of our energy come from renewable sources by the year 2030. And by the year 2040, our entire grid needs to be emissions free. Some pretty lofty targets. Right now, with what we have contracted or in the pipeline, we're at 50% renewable energy. So as you might imagine, there's still a long ways to go and a ton of work to be done. And the one small way that my team is helping to do that is by preparing our local governments all across the state for the influx of renewable energy that's going to be coming into their towns, villages, cities, and counties. So next slide, please. Yeah, so again, focusing on these three technologies for the most part. All of them have considerations that local governments are concerned about, location, where to put them, any potential impacts they might have on the environment, how much space they can take up when you do decide where to put them, decommissioning, what do we do with these things when they reach the end of their useful life, how do we tax them, maybe or not tax them. Solar in particular has visual impacts that folks are concerned about. Maybe they don't want it ruining their scenic view sheds. Maybe they're concerned that it might be taking up valuable agricultural land. These are the sorts of things we help them deal with. Similarly, wind has those same visual impacts that need to be dealt with, along with noise and also perhaps shadow flicker from the spinning turbines. And then finally, energy storage. A lot of folks are concerned, rightfully so, about fire safety. And to that end, incident management training for local fire departments. And all of these things, all of these issues, we've tried to address in our guidebooks, which are a work in progress. And next slide, please. So we address that through our guidebooks, but we also offer one-on-one technical assistance to any municipality in the state or also other local stakeholders. You know, we don't discriminate. You don't have to be a local government official to work with our team. It's all free. We're basically like free state consultants, if you will, to help local governments prepare for clean energy. We'll also do trainings, like bigger, more formal group trainings. We have resources related to zoning and permitting, property taxes, the state environmental quality review process. There's a chapter in our solar guidebook on municipal procurement for renewable energy, and so on. So, and right at the bottom of that slide there, again, like I said, all of this is posted on our website. It's just nyserda.ny.gov/siting. So pretty easy to remember. Next slide, please. And if you do go there, this is sort of what the homepage looks like. All the resources over in the left-hand side of the screen, over on the right, our email contact, a spot where municipalities can request that one-on-one technical assistance that I mentioned before. And anyone listening is also free to hit us up. Even if you're not in New York, we're happy to have conversations with anyone. Next slide, please. So just a little overview of how the renewable energy is permitted in New York. Essentially, larger systems are going to be permitted at the state level and smaller systems are going to be permitted locally. So what that breaks down to is for solar and wind, anything larger than 25 megawatts is absolutely permitted at the state level through our Office of Renewable Energy Siting, which is a separate entity from NYSERDA, which is important. We need to keep these things separate. For projects under 25 megawatts, they're permitted locally. And there's this weird thing where projects between 20 and 25 megawatts of generation can opt in to the state level process if they want to, or they can choose to be permitted locally. For energy storage, it kind of tags along. If it's co-located with one of those larger systems, it'll be permitted at the state level along with the generation. For anything else that's standalone, it's going to be permitted at the local level. Next slide, please. So as you can imagine, land use regulations and zoning in particular are really important for local governments. They want to make sure that all of these systems are being placed in their communities in a spot that they're going to be happy with and that the community is going to be happy with. A lot of them have never encountered this scale of development before, and they really don't know how to handle it. So that's where our team comes in. We've tried to take the guesswork out of it and help get them started. And so to that end, we've created guidebooks for each of the technologies for local government officials. And I would say, particularly in the solar and the storage guidebooks, the most important piece in there, it's all important, but I have to say the most important and perhaps most widely used is our model zoning laws that are in there to get folks started. So I'm going to just give you a really brief overview of sort of what's included in those. And again, it would take hours to go through all of it, so it's going to be real fast, and we'll have plenty of time for questions, I hope, at the end. So you can go ahead to the next slide. So this is just a high-level overview of all of the different chapters that are in the guidebook. If you look down to chapter 10, that's our model solar energy law. There's plenty of other stuff in there too, like I mentioned earlier, information about how to deal with property taxes, permitting and inspections, the municipal procurement toolkits there at the end. There's information about decommissioning, what to do about solar installations in agricultural districts, all of these things. I'm going to focus mostly on the model law because I think it's the most widely used part of it, like I said before. Next slide, please. So our law, it's intended to be all-inclusive of anything that a local government can and would want to regulate about a solar system, but it's not mandated. It's totally optional. It's just, again, like I said, to help them get started. It gives them flexibility throughout the model to choose different options. We provide it in a Word format, so even the stuff that we're not recommending be an option, they have the ability to adjust it as they see fit and edit it as they see fit. And I think that's important. New York is also a home rule state for the most part. So this is just the table of contents of the model law itself. I think everyone would be very bored if I tried to go through every section, so I'm just going to give you a sneak peek at sections 6, 7, and 8, which are the specific requirements for permitting different types of solar systems. Next slide, please. So just real quick, for those that may not be familiar, we've divided our law up into 3 tiers that we defined. So tier 1 being rooftop installations, tier 2 being smaller ground mount installations, tier 3 being everything else bigger that doesn't fit into those 2 buckets. And as you can imagine, the regulations that we recommend local governments adopt get more stringent as you move up through the tiers. So next slide, please. So for those tier 1 and tier 2 systems, again, building mounted or building integrated and the small ground mounted ones, we recommend that they simply be permitted with a typical building permit at the local level, and also with our New York State Unified Solar Permit, which again is one of those things that's not mandatory for local governments to adopt, but we created it and put it out there and encouraged folks to adopt it. At one point, we even put grant money behind it to sort of the carrot method, if you will, to get communities to adopt the Unified Solar Permit. Hundreds of them have, I forget what number, but it helps everyone to sort of, the developers and the communities alike, to know how to deal with the smaller systems and just get them permitted in a streamlined way. For those larger tier 3 systems, the law goes into a lot more detail. We recommend local governments use a special use permit and a site plan review. So you're really looking at them in a more customized way. Next slide, please. So just some of the permitting requirements for tier 3 systems that we recommend in the law. And again, it's totally customizable as local governments see fit. We have requirements outlined for underground things, like burying wires underground to the extent possible, talking about how wide and vehicular paths going into the site should be, what kind of signage you want and don't want, perhaps on the fencing, lighting, how, should you cut trees or not, outline requirements for decommissioning at the end of the system's useful life. We, in section 8, outlining what should be included in a site plan application and special use permit standards and things like that. So we're really trying to cover all of the ground here. And again, I'm just going to show you a couple little snippets of what you might see if you dig into those a little deeper in the model law. So special use permit standards. We have recommendations for minimum lot sizes, what sort of setbacks you'd want to see in different districts for a solar system, height limitations depending on where in the town they're going in, recommendations for lot coverage, screening and visibility, and what to do if you're using agricultural land. Next slide, please. Decommissioning, this always comes up. It's really important what to do at the end of the useful life of the system. So we have a whole section on that and what a town, you know, again, what we recommend a town or a community should require. And I think in addition to outlining how the system would be taken down at the end of its useful life, we also recommend having a decommissioning surety, which is basically the, you know, developer or project owner setting aside money in case they, you know, jump ship at some point. The town that permitted the system would have the resources to be able to decommission the system on their own, on the rare off chance that that might happen at some point in the future. So again, there's a ton more in there. We don't have time to go through it, but I just wanted to give you a little snapshot. So next slide, please. Similar to solar, we've, over the last few years, developed similar resources for battery energy storage systems, and again, developed a model zoning law for those. So you can go on to the next slide. You'll notice the table of contents in the energy storage law looks much like that in the solar law. And again, those sort of boilerplate sections, I'm not going to go through, but if you zoom in on sections 6 and 7, it's the permitting requirements for tier 1 and tier 2 as we define them, battery energy storage systems. So much like solar, the tier 1 are the smaller systems. We've made the cutoff at 600 kilowatt hours for those smaller ones. So you're thinking residential up to like maybe a small commercial building system that they might have in their basement or something. And then tier 2 is everything bigger than that, or systems that are mixing battery types, because they would create increased safety concerns, for example. So that's how we've split up our energy storage law. And so just a couple examples for visualization. Tier 1 systems, you can see a residential system there on the left, and then a couple of small commercial size systems. Maybe they're the size of a refrigerator, perhaps a couple of refrigerators. The Tesla one over there on the left, perhaps a large suitcase hanging on the wall of someone's home. Next slide. And for tier 2, again, anything bigger than that can range from like multiple refrigerators, if you will, to multiple tractor trailers like you see on the right-hand side there. So very large. To that end, much like solar, we have our law split into those 2 tiers, and the requirements become more strict and a bit more customized as the systems get bigger. So for those smaller ones, we recommend that communities adopt the battery energy storage permit, which is another one of those sort of streamlined statewide things that we've developed for them, and recommend that communities adopt to streamline the permitting process for those smaller systems. But again, it's voluntary, but we recommend it. We also recommend exempting those smaller systems from site plan review and allowing them in every zoning district. For the larger systems, much like solar, special use permit, site plan review, and specifically outline where a community would want them. So designate zoning districts where they would be allowed. Next slide, please. So in there, we outlined some requirements for approval. And again, all of these sections that you see listed here go into much more detail if you go into the model law, but I just want to highlight what's included in them. Again, things like burying utility lines, signage, only necessary lighting for safety, when you should and should not cut trees, what kind of vegetation is safe to have around an energy storage system, limitations on noise, again, decommissioning, one of our favorite things. What do you do when it's the end of the useful life? And then recommendations for what to include in site plan application and special use permit standards. Next slide, please. Yeah, so again, much like solar, we outline what should be included in an appropriate decommissioning plan for energy storage. And again, a decommissioning fund, just in case on the off chance that the developer or owner jumps ship, there's money for the host village, city, town to be able to deal with the decommissioning on their own. So next slide, please. In the site plan application, I just picked out a couple of the things that are included in there to highlight, but they're all pretty important. So one being the commissioning plan. You really want to make sure that these systems are working as intended before they're actually up and running for safety. And to that end, we also recommend requiring a fire safety compliance plan, an operations and maintenance manual where anyone can go in and see how they're running, stormwater plans, and finally, number 12, which I personally think is one of the most important things that we recommend in here, is an emergency operations plan. Like I touched on briefly, a lot of folks are concerned about the fire safety of these systems. It just so happens that New York has one of the most stringent fire codes in the country for energy storage. We just adopted it in 2019 temporarily, and then it became official code in 2020. It's based off the 2021 International Fire Code. So we feel pretty confident that any of the systems that are going in now are safe, but there's always a chance of something happening. You need to make sure that the local fire department and emergency responders are prepared. So I think number 12 here on the screen, the emergency operations plan, is absolutely critical. And we could talk about fire safety and for battery energy storage all day, but we don't have time. However, next slide, please. If you do want to learn more, this past year we put on a battery energy storage webinar series, and we recorded them all, posted them on our website. The link is there, but you can also navigate to it just by going to the nyserda.ny.gov/siting website. And so we covered battery energy storage systems 101, a whole webinar on fire safety, a webinar on zoning and permitting for them, a whole webinar dedicated to decommissioning, and then finally one dedicated to taxation and assessment for those systems. So just, that was real quick. I think we still have a few minutes for questions and answers, but the takeaway is the resources exist. Feel free to dig into them. They're all on the website. You can contact us if you have any questions. And for any folks in other states that might be in a similar position to me, if you want to plagiarize them or take them, borrow from them, have at it. They're there for everyone to use. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. That was great. We do have a few minutes for questions. Thank you to those who have been submitting. we don't have a lot of time, but I'd like to try to get to a few questions, probably at least one for each speaker. And this one came in earlier for Kai. You had discussed Somerville, Massachusetts green score, and you had mentioned that it incentivizes landscape design, certain landscape design elements as opposed to requires. So I wonder if you can talk a bit more about what the incentives are and the distinction between requirements and how the green score incentivizes green measures.
Sure. I may misspoke a little bit. So the green score is buildings are required to get a minimum score. So they have to get that minimum score in order to comply with the zoning. However, Somerville does offer density bonuses for buildings that achieve net zero, passive house levels of energy efficiency. So they're able to build, developers are able to build more dense buildings if they're able to demonstrate high performance through their energy efficiency.
Great, thank you for that clarification. Katrina, I'm going to give you two questions. They're somewhat different. One is, how is Denver planning to require buildings to electrify, specifically to heat pump levels of performance? And the second, which is quite different, is what is Denver doing to address equity in the Energized Denver program?
Thank you for the questions. So we are planning to require heat pumps when someone comes in to replace a gas water heater or a gas furnace or a gas rooftop unit starting in 2025 for those easier to electrify system types. They will have to put in an electric system unless they can demonstrate that that is an economic hardship, and we'll have to develop a lot of detail around what qualifies as an economic hardship, but they will need to show that they are not at near cost parity to install a heat pump as compared to the like-for-like gas system. and so it will happen through the permitting process. We won't require heat pumps, we will require electric systems. So we don't have a problem with sort of federal preemption where we're requiring a specific system type. We're requiring a specific fuel to be used, which is electricity. And then we will require that if they want to use electric resistance, where there's a heat pump available for that application, then solar has to be installed also to cover that capacity. So it creates a bit of a disincentive for inefficient electric resistance systems to be put in. And we have addressed equity in the Energized Denver building performance policy in a whole number of ways. It was a really big focus for the task force. They addressed equity in designing a policy that should deliver equity benefits. Electrifying buildings delivers an equity benefit by delivering safer buildings with less carbon monoxide risk. We know that homes, low-income homes, have 30 to 40% of their natural gas appliances leak carbon monoxide today, and they don't have carbon monoxide detectors in 95% of those homes. So for apartments and condos that now will have to electrify, we're delivering a big equity benefit. These are better products for better installations that are safer and more equitable for the same cost. We'll also be reducing that energy burden on low-income households with those energy efficiency improvements, and to help affordable housing buildings and other buildings serving under-resourced communities deliver those equity benefits and meet the requirements. We will have a whole bunch of extra support, technical support, and financial incentives for under-resourced buildings to help them comply.
Great, thank you. Ellen, for you, in Alexandria, when you're considering zoning rules and code changes and thinking about cost effectiveness, is it life cycle cost or first cost that's sort of the driver and the impediment, actually, in some cases?
Well, I'd say it's not really at the city of Alexandria level. The first cost seems to be applied to residential building code changes during the code development process at the national and state level. And we just have to implement those. But some life cycle costs are considered for commercial energy code development at the national level. But first costs seem to me to be the driver of zoning and land use for private development that the applicant proposes. The applicant's pushing about the first cost impact to them, and more the public buildings are taking into account life cycle costs. So it's where your point of view is. So for the applicant, they're looking at, really the applicant of a zoning case, they're looking at what it costs them initially.
Okay, so the life cycle is really an issue for the owner, it's more of a procurement decision that a public body, or for that matter, a private body, makes that decision. But from a regulatory perspective, it's really the first cost.
Yes, from regulatory, I would say for residential code. But when we worked on the commercial code development, life cycle cost is part of that calculation in some parts of it. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, Jennifer, you had spoken quite a bit about energy storage and fire safety, and I'm wondering if you can expand upon that, because I know, no pun intended, it is a hot topic. I know FDNY in New York City has had a lot of heartburn on batteries. We heard from our energy office in Illinois that they had an incident recently and have been looking into these sorts of things. So what's happening, and is NYSERDA working not only with your emergency management and first responders, but across the country with the fire safety code officials and others?
Yeah, one of our primary consultants that we work with, one of which used to be a chief at FDNY, sort of in charge of a lot of their energy storage stuff, is working with a lot of the code folks at the national level. But what New York has done in particular, I mentioned it real briefly in the blur of presentation that I did at the end there, but the 2021 International Fire Code does a really great job of addressing safety requirements for energy storage. The earlier versions of the Fire Code did not at all, including the version before that New York State had in place at the time. There was maybe, this much information about how to handle batteries, and now there's an entire chapter, pages and pages long, talking about how to space systems appropriately. So even if one, block of batteries catches fire, it's not going to propagate to the next one. Lots of good, testing standards going on at the federal level that can be adopted. And so we still have a lot of work to do. I think the most important thing we did was adopt that statewide fire code for energy storage, so that we know now any system that goes in is going to be built to that high standard. I think a lot of the perhaps horror stories you've been hearing about, incidents that have happened, those systems may have been built to some earlier standards that didn't have all of the protections in place that they would now. We're working diligently to get our first responders trained. I've done a decent amount of workshops with them. We have tons more that we could be doing. We're also, working with New York City, so very much aware of what they have going on down there and their concerns, especially being so densely populated. Yeah, and our energy storage guidebook does contain a copy of that code if anyone is curious to look at it.
Okay, great. And I suspect we'll be chatting with you further on this topic because I think there's a very strong need for better communication and cross-training across the fire community and the building energy codes community and others as well. And part of my question was also going to be whether the fire officials are somewhat skittish or whether they're open to batteries with appropriate training. But I do want to maybe go on to another question. We're already over time, but there's been some chat, but I did want to ask aloud, in thinking about electrification, have you all been also considering impacts on the grid and discussions with utilities and the utility commissions on that? And that's to anyone and everyone.
The short answer, I'll speak for NYSERDA first. In New York, the short answer is yes, absolutely. The grid is a major concern as you start inundating it more with renewable energy. So, I mean, one of the solutions, of course, is storage to make sure that when it's not being used, we can help, regulate the in and outflow of electricity from renewables, but also just the grid itself. Even with storage, it's not going to solve all of the problems. And so our state has been looking at grid upgrades a lot more intensely recently, not just upgrading the existing grid, but where are the sites in the state that would be a great spot to put, solar or wind, for example, but for the ability to interconnect to the grid. So we're trying to upgrade the existing grid to be able to handle power flow, but also expand it into the spots where we would like to be able to put renewable energy. I think it's particularly relevant in New York State. We're a little bit unique in that we have that huge New York City metro area downstate, which is like half the population of New York State all in one small area. And so we need to funnel so much energy into one small spot that it's very much on our minds, but I'll let someone else go.
Do any of the other panelists want to respond to that? Okay, so we are over time. Thank you all so much to the speakers and to the audience for participating in this. This has been a great discussion, and I view this as really an introductory discussion. I think this topic will only grow over time, not just with respect to codes and zoning, but the panoply of policy and regulatory measures that are coming into play. Thank you, Ian, for hosting, and your colleagues at PNNL. And I'll hand it back to you for any final words and a preview of the next in the series.
Great. Thank you so much, Rodney. And thanks again to all of our excellent speakers. This was really an enlightening topic and really informative presentation. So we appreciate that. Just as a quick reminder, our next seminar of this series is on equity and energy codes, and that's going to be November 18th. So be sure to sign up for that and tune in. And then we will be having future building energy code webinars. So we'll certainly notify you when those are planned, and we hope you'll join us for those as well. Again, thanks for attending, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.
This has been the National Energy Codes Conference Seminar Series hosted by the U.S. Department of Energy. Join us for a number of other important topics in building energy codes, just like today's. Participate live in our upcoming events or listen to past events on demand through our energycodes.gov training portal. There you'll find other helpful tools and resources, from education and training materials to compliance tools like our ResCheck and ComCheck software, to the latest on state code updates, to analysis of energy code impacts from energy savings to cost effectiveness, and more. Check out energycodes.gov for those and a number of other technical assistance resources from DOE, Pacific Northwest National Lab, and others. From the DOE Building Energy Codes program, we hope you learned something new about energy codes and enjoyed today's session. Thanks for being part of the conversation, and we'll see you next time.